Assalamu alaikum, students. I told you in the last lecture that we're going to start the short story now, and the travelogue that we did in the previous lectures was one kind of writing that we're going to be doing in English 503, that is your prose 2 paper. So now that we have finished with the travelogue, we're going to start with another kind of writing, and that is the short story. Now I'm sure you must be familiar with this genre, and I'm going to tell you how it developed and what we will be doing in the rest of the lectures. The previous lectures that I gave you were about Gulliver's Travels and how Jonathan Swift, in an attempt to improve the condition of society, he wrote a travelogue which used satire by showing you a kingdom. He made comments on the condition of the court, the royalty and the nobility in England. His desire basically was to reform society, particularly court society. And so he takes up this fictitious kingdom of Lilliput, and he shows through different characters what is going on in England at that time. The desire, remember, is reform. From day one he sets out to reform, and that is something that is visible throughout the voyages that he describes. We did only one voyage, and I told you in the last lecture that I would like you to read up the rest of the book also. It's a very thick volume, but don't get disturbed by the number of pages. It's very interesting reading. And now that we have dealt with the first voyage in detail, the rest will not be difficult for you to understand. So let's move on to the short story, and we have to remember that this lecture is going to be an introductory lecture. So when we start thinking about the short story, one of the first things that comes to mind is that the short form is more natural to readers than longer forms. The anecdote that lasts several hours is going to find its listeners drifting away pretty soon. Short stories, pithy stories, are what grip your attention. You make your story long-winded and people go off to sleep. And that's why we keep these lectures short also, so that you have maximum impact in the shortest possible time. Okay? So the short story is an evolved form, but the evolution took place very quickly. It did not take the amount of time that it took for, let's say, drama to evolve. Because when you talk about the evolution of drama or the development of drama, you go back to the Greeks. And from there you trace the evolution, and then you come on to English and you talk about the miracle plays and the mystery plays and the morality plays. And then you come on to something like, let's say, Elizabethan drama, Shakespearean drama, and then you go on to the different stages of drama. But where the short story is concerned, it's a totally different story altogether. Consider what happens in the telling of a tale. Even the most unprofessional anecdotalist will find himself or herself having to select some details and omit others, emphasize certain events, ignore the irrelevant or time-consuming. So choose, select, ignore, emphasize, speed up, slow down, describe key characters or not at all, in order to head towards a denouement. So what you are heading towards is a climax. It is up to the author, the teller, what he or she wants to emphasize, what details he or she wants to omit altogether. It's totally up to the teller. And therefore, when you talk about the short story, you're talking about the process of editing. The process of editing goes on throughout the composition of a short story, because you are choosing what to keep and what to discard. Because there's this process of choice, the process of selection, therefore you are editing all the time. A convincing lie, he says, a convincing falsehood is in its own way a tiny, perfect narrative. I want you to think about this. Okay? So you're inventing, you are discarding, you are adding. This process goes on through the telling of a short story. The well-told story seems to answer something very deep in our nature. We are fond of stories. We have been fond of stories almost since the time that we open our eyes and we look around us at the world that surrounds us, and we say, oh, so what does this world have to offer for me, a baby who has been newly born? And so you get stories that are told to you. And these stories we hear throughout our lives, different kinds of stories, different tellers of tales we meet, and it continues until we die. This is not a process that comes to an end during our life. Stories are told, stories have been told in our past, in the past of other people, and stories will be told when we are no more. But as long as we are in this world, we hear stories, we make up stories, we tell stories. Now the question that arises in your mind is, if this story is so true, why has it taken such a long time for the story to evolve? Why is it only in the 20th century, for example, that all of a sudden you have this stories coming up? Why is it that you wait until the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, for the short story to make an appearance? There has to be a reason for that. After all, the cultural history of the published short story is only a few decades longer than that of the film. The answer, of course, is to be found in industrial and demographic processes. So, the short story has not been with us long, just as cinema has not been with us for a long time. It's just a few decades. The short story is just a few decades earlier than the film. There has to be a reason why it took such a long time to evolve. And theorists, critics, are of the viewpoint that the short story existed in various forms, but giving it the name, giving it the nomenclature of the short story took time. And this time appeared, as the critics and the theorists say, in the mass middle-class literacy of the 19th century. The mass middle-class literacy. Remember, literacy, reading, writing, access to language had been restricted to the priests, the clergy. It is only in the middle of the 19th century that there is this movement in the middle class to be able to read and write. We're talking about the West, we're not talking about the Eastern Hemisphere, we're only talking about the Western Hemisphere, specifically speaking, England, Europe, and America. Okay? So he says that it is only in the middle of the 19th century that we see this this desire to read and write taking a really strong hold of the reading public. Before this, it had been poetry, it had been drama, it had been the novel. The novel also, remember, is a later development in the development of literature, or in the evolution of literature. The same is true of the short story. The novel developed a little earlier than the short story, and therefore the short story has a very short history. This new medium was revealed to writers, and it was like overnight they discovered that they could use this shorter medium to convey their ideas. Now you have to go back to the Industrial Revolution in order to understand the background of the short story. The Industrial Revolution in England meant a faster pace. This fast pace resulted in the evolution of the novel, and as the pace increased and you came into the second half of the 19th century, fewer people had the time to devote to reading. And those who did want to read could not afford to spend hours reading a novel. If you go back to some of the earlier novels, let's take it Samuel Richardson, Jane Austen, George Eliot, Charles Dickens. When you come to the time of Charles Dickens, you see that his novels are big in size. They're big in detail. So he gives wonderful detail, but then with the pace of life increasing, readers no longer had the time to read something that was as lengthy as a Dickensian novel. So what to do? And that is when the writers discovered that there is this other genre, that is the short story. And in this short story, the time constraints are kept in mind. So when writers discovered that they had this new literary form on their hands, the short story sprang into being. It did not have a history of development or evolution the same way that, for example, drama had. This is like a goddess springing from the head of Zeus and in full maturity. Okay? And once it springs out, then you have the developmental stages. There weren't any, let's say, first steps like you have with babies that they start to learn to stand up, and then they take the first step and then the second step, and then maybe they fall or falter and then they get up and then they start walking. Nothing like that with the short story. It's something that happened almost overnight. The fact that in the early to mid-19th century, Hawthorne and Poe and Turgenev were capable of writing classic and timeless short stories virtually from the outset signals that the ability had always been dormant within the human imagination. So mid-19th century, you have these great short story writers, and these short stories have not been equaled. You know, these are not stories that were in the stages of development. These were stories that were full-fledged stories, and they were very developed, very full-bodied stories. And the fact that Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe and Turgenev were writing short stories shows you that there was no developmental stages, no periods during which we can say, okay, the short story was in its preliminary stages, and then it was in the middle stage, and this is the final stage. Nothing like that with the short story. It arrived fully fledged in the middle 19th century, and by the end of the 19th century, you had the Russian writer Anton Chekhov writing stories which are classics. Nobody has been able to touch the level of excellence that you see in a Chekhovian short story. Nobody has been able to touch that. In fact, the Chekhovian form is a form by itself. It's a different category altogether. And that's a stage of excellence that no writer has been able to achieve. Now, when we discuss the introduction to the short story, or the short story as a genre, as a form of literature, the questions that arise in our mind is, so who wrote and published the first true modern short story? Who was the great precursor? The way we say that, okay, English poetry starts with Chaucer, and English drama had its heyday with Shakespeare. What about the short story? Who are the precursors? Where does it have its origin? And so, let me take you back a bit. Short narratives and tales had existed for centuries in one form or another. So the story of Scheherazade, Boccaccio's Decameron, and the Canterbury Tales, they're all short stories, just as subplots in plays and novels, satires, pamphlets, sagas, narrative poems, they're all short stories. Because whatever the form may be, what is told is a story. So what's the first literary text that we can point to and say, this is a modern short story? And when we ask this question, this is the first modern short story, there are various points of view. Walter Scott's The Two Drovers has been called the first modern short story. And Walter Scott is as good a point as any to start off the history or the development of the short story. It's convenient if only because the short story's subsequent rapid development was international, and Scott's influence was international also. Sir Walter Scott had inspired not only novelists like George Eliot and Thomas Hardy in England. His influence had gone over into France, on to Russia with Pushkin, and across the ocean, across the continent of Europe into James Fenimore Cooper and Nathaniel Hawthorne in America. So Walter Scott's influence permeates writing not only within England, not only within Europe, it goes across Europe, it goes to Russian literature, and in the other direction it travels to the United States of America. And if one thinks of the influence these writers had on writers like Flaubert and Maupassant, Chekhov, Poe and Melville, that is when we can begin to trace the lines of the modern short story. So these are the great names. When you talk about the short stories or classical short stories, you have in France you have Flaubert, you have Maupassant, in Russia you have Chekhov, you have Turgenev, and you have Edgar Allan Poe, you have Herman Melville. There are a lot of short story writers out there, and because this is happening in the middle of the 19th century and you have greater communication, faster communication, therefore they reach out to different parts of Europe, and not just different parts of Europe but also across the ocean to the United States. The only problem here is that in Britain, after Sir Walter Scott, the short story hardly has a presence, and the reason is that the novel was very popular. Writers in France, Russia and America accepted this form more readily than writers in Britain. So with Walter Scott, you have the influence going outside home, outside Britain, and not so much inside Britain. It's not until the 1880s with R.L. Stevenson that you find somebody in England who is writing short stories of the same caliber or focusing on the short story to the same extent that Walter Scott did. And thenceforth, of course, you have other writers who are also coming in. So in many ways, the true beginnings of the modern short story are to be found in America, with the publication of Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales in 1837. So think of the work that is being done in America in the short story in the 1830s, and think of what is happening in England at that time, virtually no work. So in America, there was greater focus on writing the short story. And again, you have to compare the situation in Europe or in England with that in America. The pace of progress in America was far more rapid than the rate of progress in England. So where England was sort of struggling with the Industrial Revolution, the Americans caught on to this form and produced some great short stories. So when Poe read Hawthorne, he made the first real analysis of the difference between the short story and the novel. And his definition of a short story was that it is a narrative that, quote unquote, can be read at one sitting. A novel cannot be read in one sitting because it is far more complex. It's more detailed, it's lengthier. A short story is shorter, it's pithy, it is a condensed form, and therefore it can be read in one sitting. So what Poe was trying to do was to pinpoint the short story's single most defining characteristic, that it's a narrative that can be read at one sitting. And he continues with this comparison between the short story and the novel with the definition of the short story by saying, in the whole composition there should be no word written, and this is within quotation marks, in the whole composition there should be no word written of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not to the one pre-established design. And by such means, with such care and skill, a picture is at length painted which leaves in the mind of him who contemplates it with a kindred art a sense of the fullest satisfaction. Okay, so what Poe is trying to say here is that the short story as a narrative is one which is complete, can be read in one sitting, and has an aim that is supported throughout the narrative. There can be no divergences, there can be no two threads running through the short story. It's a single cohesive whole, and not only is it a cohesive whole, but it is so concise that no part of it can be removed without damaging it. In other words, simpler words, you cannot summarize it. A short story cannot be summarized. If you can summarize it, it's not a short story. That's it in very, very simple terms. You can't summarize it. It's the shortest form of the narrative. And this is the area in which the short story differs from the novel. He says the effect of reading a good short story is different from the effect of reading a good novel. Great modern short stories possess a quality of mystery and resonance that cannot be pinned down or analyzed. And of course, the name that comes to your mind at once is that of Edgar Allan Poe. And he says it's the writers who followed Poe in whom we see this quality really functioning, and there's one writer in whom you see this functioning, and that is Herman Melville, the writer who wrote the novel Moby Dick, the story of the great white whale. So coming back to Poe, he says that a short story must be so gripping that it has to be read in one sitting. There can be no leaving the short story to another time, another day, another place. It has to be completed in one go. And it has to have an element of mystery in it. And this is where writers like Poe excel. And of course, Poe is closely followed by Herman Melville. Melville hated writing stories. Interesting fact. He's claimed to do so purely for money. By this time, writing had come to be a source of income. Prior to this, you have people like, let's say, Dickens writing and publishing his chapters in newspapers. But the full-length novel was something that took time to write, a lot of time, a lot of effort. Whereas the short story condensed not only the narrative, but it also reduced the amount of time you spent in writing it. And it is said that Herman Melville hated writing short stories, and he did it only because he could do it well, and this was one way in which he could earn a little money. So in spite of the fact that Melville said that he hated writing short stories, his Benito Cereno and Bartleby the Scrivener are beautiful examples of the modern short story, and they are examples that the modern short story sort of comes into bloom all of a sudden. And in Melville's stories, you can see the first real exemplars of the short story's strange power. And of course, if you understand and relish what Melville is doing in Benito Cereno, then you can understand and relish what is happening in Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, that's one of my very favorite stories. If we have time, we're going to be discussing that in this paper also. Conrad's The Secret Sharer, Chekhov's House with the Mezzanine, Hemingway's Hill Like White Elephants, Catherine Manfield's Prelude, Carver's Cathedral, and of course Nabokov's Spring at Fialta, etc., etc. There's a long list of short stories that are truly wonderful and provide you with an amazing reading experience. And the great thing with short stories is that the time in which the short story was developing, that is the middle 19th century and continuing into the 20th and 21st centuries, was a time of communication not just between nations or countries, but also between languages. So that the story that is written in one language is very soon found to be translated into many different languages. So that when we talk about the stories of, let's say, somebody like Maupassant or Chekhov, we do not have to read the original. We don't have to know the language of the original story. The translation convinces us of the writer's point of view. The translation provides entertainment, information, and a wonderful, wonderful reading experience. So we cannot summarize or paraphrase the totality of the effect of these stories because something escapes or defies analysis. It is Melville who establishes the benchmark for what the short story can attain and allows us to set the standards by which all the other great writers of the form can be measured. So Melville is the benchmark, and it is on that benchmark that we place all the other short story writers and see how they match up to, or how they come up to the level of the short stories. Turgenev was also publishing short stories in the 1850s, but his primary contribution is to what Chekhov had started. And that brings us to the question, why is Chekhov the greatest short story writer ever? And this will have to have a detailed answer. But these answers seem inadequate because there's something about Chekhov's short stories that is elusive. It's mystifying and mysterious at the same time. He saw and understood, writing in Russia, he saw and understood that life is godless, random and absurd, that all history is the history of unintended consequences. Now I want you to think about this, because this is what moved Chekhov to write those great short stories. He knew, for instance, that being good will not spare you from awful suffering and injustice, that the slothful can flourish effortlessly, and that mediocrity is the one great demonic force. So, what is it that moved Chekhov to write such powerful short stories? Chekhov was living at a time when there was a lot that was going on in the world. And he had come to the conclusion that in order to survive in this world, you don't have to be a wonderful person. The mediocre can survive just as well as the genius. The good will survive, will be able to have a life just as the evil will. Evil does not die out because it is evil. So Chekhov came up with a lot of ideas that were realistic and that were based on his experiences. So when he talks about the slothful and the mediocre flourishing at the same time as the energetic, the active, and the genius, he is talking about real life. He's talking about life as he found, based on the experiences that he had, based on his knowledge of the world. So by abandoning the manipulated beginning, middle and end plot, by refusing to judge his characters, by not striving for a climax or seeking neat narrative resolution, he was able to present short stories that were powerful. So there's no rising action, climax and falling action. There is no focus on making his characters out to be rounded. There's no beginning, middle or end, no chronological sequence, in other words, as far as Chekhov is concerned. His stories appear agonizingly, almost unbearably lifelike. So they are representatives of real life, of what he saw around him, and his short stories represent the end of the first phase of the modern short story. The first phase of the modern short story. From his death onwards, his influence is massive. So it's not that the Chekhovian short story comes to an end with Chekhov. That is the benchmark. That is what everything has to be measured up to. So you find that the stories that are following Chekhov are also in the Chekhovian tradition. That's one aspect, one form that is being given. Until in the 20th century, he says that the short story becomes almost exclusively Chekhovian. Joyce is Chekhovian. Catherine Mansfield and Raymond Carver are Chekhovian. They could not exist without him. In fact, he says perhaps all short stories written after Chekhov, in one way or another, are influenced by the stories of Anton Chekhov. It's only in the last 20 years or thereabouts that writers have started to emerge from his shadow and write stories that are not Chekhovian in nature. But with Chekhov and the advent of the 20th century, the modern short story also enters its golden age. The early decades of the century, the 20th century, you could become rich writing short stories, particularly in America, because there was a lot of publication going on. Magazines proliferated, readers were eager, circulations rose depending on the kind of material that was being published. And in this you can go back to your Dickens and find out that the newspapers in which Dickens was publishing chapters of his novels, the circulation of those newspapers improved when Dickens had a chapter that was being published. It's not like these days when everything is available on the internet. All they had was the print medium. So whether it was in a newspaper that a story was being published or in a magazine, the circulation of the magazine or the newspaper was dependent upon the short stories that were being published. So in the beginning of the 20th century, you could make a lot of money writing short stories. In the 1920s, Scott Fitzgerald was paid $4,000 for a single short story. So imagine the amount of money that people were making and they could make. You need to multiply by at least 20 to arrive at any idea of the value of the sum in today's terms. So $4,000 being paid in the 1920s was equivalent to what? $80,000 for one short story. That was the impact, the strength of the impact on the circulation of the newspapers and the magazines. So it is about at this time also that the short story's popularity grows, and it's at this time also that it is subjected to the pressures and influence of modernism, and the form of the short story metamorphosed or changes or evolves, and certain types of short story became distinct from each other, and the categories of the form grew, they increased in number. So until the beginning of the 20th century, there are two great traditions: the event plot story and the Chekhovian story. The event plot story, and now we come to how we differentiate between a Chekhovian story and the event plot story. The event plot story refers to the style of plotted story that flourished pre-Chekhov. That is, before he brought on this formless story, the story where there was no beginning, middle and end, there was the event plot story that existed, that flourished. And in the 21st century you have these two categories, the event plot story and you have the Chekhovian story. Either you're writing about a certain incident that takes place, an event that takes place, and that means that the story has a plot, and the story has to stick to the plot. Or you have the Chekhovian short story, that is, you do not need a plot, you don't need to have everything in chronological order. You can begin in the from the middle, go on to the past, and then come back to the future. There's a lot of license that you have in a Chekhovian story. Perhaps the most dominant of these new forms is what is termed the Modernist story, in which deliberate, often baffling obscurity is made a virtue, however limpid the style in which it is written. And this is very, very strong criticism of modern short stories, where he says that the modernist short story is a deliberate attempt to obscure facts, to confuse the reader, and Hemingway is the great practitioner here. And perhaps after Chekhov, Hemingway is the short story writer whose influence is the greatest on the evolution and the later stages in the development of the short stories. And then you come to the cryptic story. In this form of story, there is a meaning to be deciphered that lies beneath the apparently straightforward text. So you have to go deep into the text, read the underlying meanings, and it is then only that you can understand what the story is about and what the writer is trying to convey to you. Mid-20th century writers like Nabokov, Calvino, and Borges are representative of this mode of writing, that is the cryptic story. And he also gives you examples of Rudyard Kipling's in stories such as Mrs. Bathurst and Mary Postgate. So Rudyard Kipling is another writer who was very influential in promoting the short stories. The mini novel story is a variety of the event plot, trying to do in a few pages what the novel does in hundreds. So you could put Dickens's Christmas specials in this. You could also bring in writers like, let's say, Saul Bellow, who is a Jewish American writer, and he's written some very great short stories. His short stories are longer than the Chekhovian short stories. The final category is what is called the biographical story, and it utilizes the impedimenta of the non-fiction book, that is footnotes, authorial asides, illustrations, quotations, font changes, statistics, textual gimmickry, etc., etc. And this is the most recent transmutation of the short story form. So this is the most recent form, and it obviously has its origin in America in the 1990s, and you have some of the younger writers who specialize in this. In the hands of less capable writers, this mode, and that is the biographical, can easily degenerate into the whimsical. So you've got to be very careful about what you're presenting and how your material is being presented, because the biographical story also includes stories that introduce real people into fiction or write fictive episodes of real life. This can also be seen as an attempt by fiction, in a word, deluged by the advertising media and the 24-hour rolling news. That's what we are we're experiencing now, and we have been experiencing even in Pakistan in the last few years. So it's not just the Western world that is suffering a deluge of information. We are sailing in the same boat. This form of the short story owes little to the Chekhovian example and is potentially the most interesting new direction the short story has taken, that is the biographical. So what is interesting is that the two main styles, the event plot and the Chekhovian, they're still hugely dominant. You cannot say, for example, that the Chekhovian style came to an end with the death of Anton Chekhov. You cannot say that when Chekhov started writing, the event plot story died. These are still the two main categories of short stories. The other varieties make an appearance. There are forms that evolve, but there's very little experiment that has been done in these different forms, in the main is the event plot or the Chekhovian style that dominates even to this day, even in the 21st century. That is all for today, but before I sign off, or before I leave you in this lecture, I want to quickly go through what we have done up to this point, so that your mind is refreshed with what we have done, because we took a big leap today from discussing Jonathan Swift's travelogue to the introduction to the short story. What we have been discussing today is the fact that the short story did not evolve over a long process of time like poetry did, or like drama did, or even for that matter a novel. The short story springs up almost ready-made in the 19th century, and all of a sudden there is this hectic activity in the field of writing, and you find people writing short stories. One reason is the Industrial Revolution and the fact that the pace of progress increased tremendously in the 19th century. We talk about the Industrial Revolution in Europe. We talk about so many other things that were happening in Europe at that time. You have to keep in mind the political and historical backgrounds side by side with the socio-economic background of the times, and that is, you had 2 world wars in Europe, and these 2 wars had a huge and lasting impact on all aspects of life. Literature, being the portrayal of life, was impacted by these 2 wars, so that whatever was produced was either a direct or indirect result of the 2 world wars. So what you had in the 19th century was the overnight evolution of the short story, and when we discuss the evolution of the short story, there are a few names that come to mind. In England, we have Sir Walter Scott, who started, you can say, writing short stories, and he had a lot of influence on writers across Europe as well as into the Americas. But in England itself, after Walter Scott, you don't have any short story writers until the almost the end of the century. In the 1880s, you have Robert Louis Stevenson writing stories in the English language in England. But this genre had a very fast moving and very strong impact on European writers. You had the Russians being influenced, you had the French being influenced, you have some great short stories written by Flaubert, by Maupassant. In the same way, in Russia, you had Turgenev, you had Chekhov, and Chekhov's influence is massive as far as the form of the short story is concerned, because to this day there are 2 main categories for short stories. One is the event plot story that was favored by writers like, let's say, Maupassant, and then you have the Chekhovian story, which does not observe the chronological sequence of the beginning, middle, and end. Rather, it takes up an action, an incident in the middle, and then goes backwards and forwards. So when we discuss the different categories within the genre of short stories, we find that we have the biographical category, we have the cryptic story, we have different forms of short stories, but the major influence that you have is that of Chekhov. And Chekhov's influence grows across the ocean into the Americas, and you find out that it's in the it's in the United States that you find a lot of the work being done on short story. You have some really great writers there. You have writers like Herman Melville, you have Raymond Carver. All of them are producing work in the 20th century that can in no way be compared to Chekhov's stories, but which have earned a place for themselves. They have earned a name for themselves. So with the publication of the Twice Told Tales, you have a whole host of other stories in the United States that were responsible for the development of the short story as a genre in itself. And as we proceed with this module, that is ENG503 Prose 2, I'm going to introduce you to different short stories, to different writers who whose writings play a great role in the development of literature. And you'll find out that these writers focus on different aspects of life. There's not just one aspect of life that forms the focus, because life has become far more complex in the 19th and 20th centuries than it was in the earlier centuries. You find this complexity being shown in the literature of the times also. You've been doing modern drama, and you see how different modern drama is from classical drama. You've done the development in poetry, and you see that the Romantics and the Victorians are very different from, let's say, the poetry that was written by Chaucer or Spenser or Milton. So in the same way, the short story, being a very recent addition to the field of literature, to the different forms of literature, at the same time has kept pace with the progress and development that is taking place in the world at large. And so there's been a lot of short stories that have been produced. For example, at the beginning of the 20th century, you could make a lot of money writing short stories because it helped in the circulation of newspapers, of magazines and periodicals. So there was a lot of money to be made. It was something that added to the status of a newspaper or a magazine. And so with the introduction of the short story, we have a whole new world that is opening up in the field of literature. and it's a form that that we can take advantage of, and that has that is said to have become a very very acceptable form, in the sense that the story is short. It can be read through at one sitting, and it does not require the focus of attention and the concentration that a lengthy novel, for example, would involve. So reading a short story is easier, less time consuming, more rewarding, because you get the maximum impact in the shortest possible time and space, and that makes it very, very contemporary. Thank you very much for being patient, and in the next lecture I'm going to introduce you to some great short story writers and short stories. So until next time, Allah Hafiz.